Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here in Regina this afternoon, and welcome to all of those who are joining us via webinar. My name is Peter Federko, and I'm the CEO of the Saskatchewan Workers' Compensation Board, and it's my pleasure to share some information with you here this afternoon. So what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is a snapshot of what your 2017 premium rates would have looked like had we implemented the new rate-making model effective January 1st, 2017, compared to what your premium rates for 2017 are. So we're not sharing with you our 2018 rates because we actually don't know what those are at this particular point in time because we don't have the experience to set 2018 rates yet. But just for comparative purposes, to provide you with at least some idea of what the potential impacts on your industry code might be, we're doing a side-by-side comparison between your premium rates under the existing model compared to the premium rates under the enhanced or new rate-making model. Plan on spending about an hour going through the information, and we do have another hour available at the end for any questions you might have. Judging by the size of the crowd here, I don't think we're going to have too much trouble getting through all the questions in an hour. Those of you who are joining us by webinar, you have the opportunity to submit questions through the webinar as well, and we're happy to address all of those questions at the end. If for some reason we do not get to all of the questions, or you get back to your offices and as you're going through the information, because we're going to give you quite a bit of information today, and I'm going to do my level best not to get terribly technical with you, but stay at a fairly high and understandable level. But if you happen to get back to the office and you think of something, you can always submit your questions through our website, and I'll share that link with you a little bit later. So today we're actually talking about the service codes being S31 and S32, just to make sure you're on the right plane. So we have a bit of an agenda for today. We're going to quickly go over just WCB background, how we came to be in the first place and why we exist. We're going to share with you what we were trying to achieve and the purpose of the rate model review. And then we're going to share with you, as I said, the 2017 impacts on your industry as a result of these changes, and then talk about next steps. So prior to 1915 in Canada, the only recourse that an injured worker had in the event that they were injured and could not work was to actually sue their employer, and very few times was that worker actually successful in winning any of the lawsuits. However, in the event that they did win, it often resulted in the bankruptcy of the employer, which was not good for the economy either. And in Ontario in about 1911, the issue of what happens to these workers who have no other recourse kind of came to light, because in the absence of any insurance system that could replace their wages and cover their costs. Remember, back in the early 1900s, there was no universal health care. You kind of had to pay for the health care. You had no means to pay for that. In the absence of any other system to cover the costs of the injury and replace the workers' earnings, these individuals landed on the Social Security system, and that began getting very expensive for the government. And so in 1913, the government of Ontario appointed a gentleman by the name of William Meredith, who's now Sir William Meredith, to study the system. And Meredith came up with the workers' compensation system based on what he coined the historic compromise. And the historic compromise simply spoke to the trade-off made between employers and injured workers in the establishment of this compensation system. Employers agreed that they would fund 100% the cost of the workers' compensation system, and in exchange for which injured workers would give up the right to actually sue the employer. So the employer was protected from lawsuit, in exchange for which agreed to fund the costs of the workers' compensation system. This became law in Ontario in 1915, and in 1929 Saskatchewan introduced its first workers' compensation legislation, which mirrored all of the principles that Sir William Meredith believed were important and continue to be the foundational pieces for all workers' compensation systems in Canada and, quite frankly, in other parts of the world. Meredith's principles, which are today continue to be known as the Meredith Principles, were fivefold. And the first one said the system had to be anchored on a no-fault basis. So there's no need to prove negligence on the part of the employer or anything else. If you had an injury related to your work, the question of fault would not come into question. Second thing he said is the system has to ensure security of benefits. In other words, there can never be a question on the system's ability to actually pay for the benefits to which the injured workers might be entitled. And so if you look at our legislation in Saskatchewan, there's a provision in our legislation that requires us to be 100% fully funded at all times, so that the jeopardy of not being able to pay future benefits to injured workers really does not even come into play, is not in question at all. The third principle he introduced was something called collective liability, and this is a principle that's common to really all insurance systems. And when we talk about workers' comp, really this is work injury insurance is what we're talking about. And collective liability simply means the pooling of insurance risks. So if you think about this within the context of your own home insurance or your car insurance, we do not self-insure our homes or our vehicles. We are members of a risk pool, depending on the make of the car, the age of the driver, the size of your home, any risks or hazards like fireplaces or whatnot that might be associated with your particular home. And we're grouped with similar homeowners and vehicle owners, and we share collectively the liability of all claims that come into our pool by paying an annual premium. So the whole concept of collective liability, as Meredith envisioned it, was that employers would collectively share in the costs and liability associated with the system. Not individually, but collectively. Fourthly, he said that in order to ensure that the system operates at arm's length from government, so that politics never enters into the level of the premium rates or the entitlement to benefits, that the system needed to be administered by an independent organization. And so we in Saskatchewan, again, funded 100% by premiums and what we earn off our investments, do operate at arm's length from the government. Lastly, he said, the principle of exclusive jurisdiction needs to be in place. And what exclusive jurisdiction means is that there's only one place that you can actually buy workers' compensation, and all reports of workplace injury must go to this one organization, that being the Workers' Compensation Board. So our board has exclusive jurisdiction to receive all of these claims, to cover employers who are required to be covered in the province of Saskatchewan, and there's really no alternatives with respect to that. As I said, these principles form the foundation of our compensation system and other compensation systems throughout Canada and really stood the test of time, even though they didn't come in until 1915 in Ontario. So what is involved in the process of establishing premium rates? So there's really three steps. And the first step harkens back to this notion of collective liability. So in Saskatchewan, we have about 45,000 plus employers that are registered with us in various industries across the province. Our first step in establishing premium rates is to classify these employers into industry rate codes on the basis of their primary business activity. So all of you folks being in similar businesses, having similar business activities, are grouped within your either S31 or S32 code. And together you collectively share in, you are responsible for the costs associated with all of the injuries in your particular industry rate code. In Saskatchewan, we have divided up all of the employers covered by workers' comp in Saskatchewan into 50 individual rate codes. And that forms the experience of those 50 individual rate codes forms the basis of the premium rate that's established for that group of employers. The second step now is to actually go through a formal process where we determine the applicable rate for each of those respective industry rate codes. And once that base, and I'll talk more about that in some detail as we get into the presentation, once that base industry rate is determined, then we look for individual accountability on the part of the employer. So an employer, again, using our vehicle insurance as an analogy, if we have good driving records, we will get a rebate from SGI. If we have bad driving records, the cost of our insurance is going to go up. And so similarly in workers' compensation, we have something called the Experience Rating Program. And the Experience Rating Program seeks to recognize individual employer experience that may be different from the rest of the industry, to hold individual employers accountable for their own experience. In Saskatchewan, we have two programs under the experience rating, and the first one is referred to as the standard program. Standard program is for what we would call smaller employers, and that by definition is an employer who pays us less than $21,000 in the most recent 3 consecutive years. So if you fall into the standard program, your entitlement to a penalty, surcharge, or a discount is based on the number of injuries that you would have. It's frequency based. The maximum discount you can get under the standard program is 25%, and the maximum surcharge or penalty that you can receive is 75%. The other program is referred to as the advanced program. The advanced program is for employers who pay us at least $21,000 in premium over the last 3 consecutive years. That program is cost-based. So it's based on the cost of claims, not the number of claims. And in that particular program, if you're worse than the average for your industry group, you're going to pay a surcharge. And if you're better than the average, you're going to receive a discount. Under the advanced program, the maximum surcharge is 30%. The maximum discount is 30%. The maximum surcharge is 30%. No, 20. Oh my God. The maximum discount is 30% and the maximum surcharge is 200%. Now what we're going to talk about in terms of changes to the rate, it only took me 3 attempts, Gord, but I did finally get it right. What we're going to talk about in terms of enhancements to the rate-making model in no way alters the way in which that experience rating program is going to work. So with respect to the discussion today, we're only going to get to as far as step 2, because then the experience rating just kicks in the way it otherwise would have under the existing model. So why did we undertake this review? So in 2015, we undertook something called an asset liability study, and we'd just been through a review process of our investment strategies in terms of how we are allocating the funds that we invest into the various asset classes that might be available. And so we wanted an asset liability study which basically measures the degree to which we've matched the behavior of our investments with the behavior of our liabilities. So we actually need the earnings off of our investments in order to pay future claims costs. So the degree to which we can match what we're earning on the investments with the liability impacts the entire financial system and can have an impact on the rate-making model. As part of that review, the actuary, who was Eckler that did that review for us, he suggested we actually review the rate-making model. In addition to that, several employers had given us feedback with respect to the reactivity of the existing model. They felt that the model was not reacting quick enough to changes in injury performance. And so for those 2 reasons, the board agreed that we should embark on the review of our rate-making model. And in the process of reviewing that model, what we sought to do was really balance what oftentimes are seen as competing interests. So I talked to you about collective liability. That's the degree to which all of us in our industry codes share in the liabilities. But we also wanted to ensure that there was strong accountability for each particular industry rate code, so there wasn't necessarily cross-subsidization going on. But if you increase the accountability, you actually decrease the collective liability and vice versa. And so it was trying to find that balance between those kind of competing principles. The other two that we look closely at are increasing the reactivity of the model without creating additional volatility in the premium rates. One of the things we've heard loud and clear from employers is they don't like rates that bounce all over the place. They like more stability in the premium rates. So gradual increases and decreases are far more palatable than huge increases and then huge decreases and then huge increases and decreases. So again, to the extent that we create a model that's more reactive, we put at jeopardy the stability of the premium rate. And if we focus strictly on the stability of the premium rate, then we don't make the model as reactive as it should be. So we really focused around trying to balance the, these principles that, again, often are seen as competing. So the fundamental reason that we establish premium rates is to collect enough premium to pay for the future costs of claims. So the 2017 premium rates that you're going to be paying us this year are intended to pay for all of the costs of all of the injuries that will occur in 2017. To the extent that our model does not predict the future costs, we're likely to get the premium requirement wrong, which then puts the security of benefits at risk because we may not be able to cover the future benefit costs. On the alternative, we might be collecting more money than we have to if the model isn't accurately predicting what the future costs might be. Secondly, the model must be fair and equitable across all industry codes and among employers. And thirdly, it had to be anchored in actuarial principles, actuarial standards, so that there was some science behind this particular art. So what were the findings of the rate model review? At a very high level, what the actuary found was that the current model does a good job, is accurate in forecasting costs at the board level. Now, what do I mean by board level? I told you earlier that we divide up all of the industry covered by workers' comp into 50 individual rate codes. When I talk about the board level, I'm talking about the collective experience of all 50, not any individual one. So you may recall that in the last fall, we published what our average premium rate was for 2017. It's $1.24. Nobody actually pays $1.24 to us in premium. If they do, it's pure coincidence. $1.24 is the premium required to collectively fund all of the predictive costs for all 50 rate codes. What the actuary found was at that board level, at the 50 rate code level, the model was doing a good job of predicting costs and setting premiums. As a matter of fact, when we ran the average premium rate under the enhanced model, it pumped out a premium rate of $1.24. So this is not about increasing the premium revenue. It's about creating a fair and equitable system at the rate code level. Is what the actuary said is your model needs some tweaking and enhancing, because when you get down to the individual industry code level, it's not necessarily balancing that rate stability with reactivity and accountability with collective liability. It's not necessarily fair and equitable when you get down to the individual rate codes. But the model's not broken. It just needs a few enhancements in order to improve its ability to forecast costs at the individual rate code level. Eckler had 7 recommendations, and I'm going to talk in detail about all of these with the exception of one, and that's the second one, which is classification. For the third or fourth time, we have 50 industry rate codes in Saskatchewan. What Eckler said is many of those rate codes are very, very small. We'll only have a few hundred employers in some of those rate codes. And that can be problematic, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail when I talk about the credibility. But if any sample size is not large enough to actually represent the experience, then it's not going to be very reliable in predicting the future. And so what Eckler recommended was that we establish a process by which we periodically review the classification of industry and consider merging or amalgamating some of those smaller rate codes to make a larger, more credible, more predictable industry code. No decision has been made to actually do that. There will be no mergers in the foreseeable future of the existing rate codes. What we have committed to is building this process that would include, of course, consultation with employers impacted by any potential mergers of rate codes, as well as analysis that's required to go along with that. So stay tuned for when we actually might embark on this classification review, but in the near term, there really isn't anything planned. So the first thing I want to reinforce before we get into the detail of this again is we are not sharing with you what your 2018 premium rate will be. We are simply providing you with a comparison of your 2017 premium rate under the existing model and what that would have been had we implemented the new model January 1st, 2017. Now, why didn't we do it in 2017? As you'll see, some of the enhancements to the model can have fairly significant impacts on individual rate codes. And we thought it better that we provide kind of a year here to provide you with some information about the enhancements to the model, the impacts on you, so that you can better understand it, and perhaps prepare for what might be coming. The 2017, remember, is 100% dependent upon the actual injury experience in 2017 injuries. What you're going to see in terms of premium rates, in all likelihood, will change unless your injury experience for 2018 is identical to what it is in 17, which is highly unlikely. So these are not 18 rates. We will get those to you in the fall like we always do. And at that point in time, you'll know specifically what the impact is on the 2018 rates. The feedback we are looking for today, and I'll remind you of this again later, is how do we actually transition from the old to the new and mitigate any impacts that might have on you as an industry code. So the first kind of major recommendation that Eckler made has to do with something that's referred to as credibility of the industries. Credibility simply refers to the reliability of past experience in predicting future experience. And as I said, the smaller the rate code, the greater the volatility in the injury experience, because one claim can cause fairly significant swings in your injury costs. And therefore, the less representative it is of what's likely to happen in the future. The broader, the bigger the experience period, the more reliable it is. So under the existing model, the way we deal with credibility, and we have many small, I don't think we have any industry codes that are 100% credible, which means their experience is 100% reliable in terms of predicting future experience. So in order to mitigate that and reduce the volatility, what we actually do is we adjust the individual industry rate code experience by the trends that we're seeing for the experience of all 50 rate codes at the board level. So we mitigate. If we see, the injuries at the board level starting to drop, but the smaller non-credible rate codes increasing, we would force down that injury experience based on the experience that we're seeing at the overall board level. Eckler said that's not good practice. It is too subjective, and I'll talk about predictability of costs in a second, and injury frequency and injury rates are not really a good predictor of costs. He said, rather, the way you should deal with non-credible industries is, first of all, change your definition of how you determine whether an industry is credible or not. Under the existing model, we look at payroll levels in kind of a convoluted formula to determine the degree to which an industry is credible. Eckler said, don't look at payrolls, look at costs. And so under the new model, if an industry has $16.5 million of costs flowing through its rate code over the most recent 5-year period, it will be considered to be 100% credible, which means its past experience is 100% reliable in predicting future injury experience. Under the existing model, for all rate codes, we look at the average of the last 5 years and use that 5-year experience, again, adjusted for board-level activity, to predict what the future is going to be. Eckler said instead of doing that kind of subjective adjustment based on board experience, for those industry codes that are not credible, use a blend of 5 and 10 years experience. Increase the sample size for those small rate codes. So you're not looking at just the average of the last 5 years, but you're looking at the average of the last 10 years. If an industry code has roughly $10 million going through it over the last 5 years, it would consider to be 60% credible. So in determining the credibility and the costs associated with that rate code, what we would do is we would look at the 5-year average and we'd apply the 60% credibility rating to it. And then we'd look at the 10-year average and we'd apply 40% credibility to it. So we have a blend now of a 10-year average and a 5-year average, which is far more reliable in terms of predicting future costs than the existing model was. So what's the impact of this particular change on the industries we're talking about here today? So S32, which is described as personal, business, and leisure services, would have seen its premium rate go down by 7 cents. And the reason for that is when we calculate the credibility and the experience at the industry code level using the new credibility method, the experience at the rate code is actually better than the experience was at the board level. So putting in that adjustment for board level experience actually projected higher costs than what the new model will. And in addition to that, the 10-year costs, so under the existing model, remember we only looked at 5-year costs. Now we're looking at a blend. So S32 would be 81% credible. So what that means is we would take 81% of the 5-year average and 19% of the 10-year average. The 10-year average is actually better, the 10-year average is actually higher than the 5-year average, so the blend would actually drive up the costs. So you have this element of your rate code would be increased because of the blend of the 5 and 10 year, but it would be driven down because the experience at the S32 level is better than it was at the board level, and the net effect is a reduction of 7 cents. For S33, the opposite would occur. You actually would have seen a 5-cent increase because the experience at the industry level is worse than the experience was at the board level, and so it was artificially keeping that down. Combined with the fact that the 10-year costs are actually higher than the 5-year costs, this rate code is only 55% credible. So 55% of the costs would be the result of the 5-year average. 45% of the costs would be the result of the 10-year average. And because the 10-year costs are higher, that overall average is going to go up. The next recommendation that Eckler had was with respect to the predictability of costs. Under the current model, as I said, we seek to use the number of time loss claims and injury rates to forecast the future costs. So we would seek to determine how many claims we expect to have next year and what the costs are associated with that. And that worked well for a number of years. But over the years, we have seen significant reductions in the time loss claim counts and in overall claims and in the injury rates. However, we have not seen a corresponding decrease in claims costs. As a matter of fact, we've seen increases in claims costs. We've seen an increased proportion of long-term claims. So as injury rates go down, if there was a good correlation between costs and number of injuries, you would expect to see costs going down. In fact, the opposite is happening. Time loss counts are no longer a good predictor of the actual costs. So what Eckler said is forget about it. Do not rely on the number of time loss injuries. Instead, adjust your 5 or 10-year blended average cost by the change in the workforce, which is the percentage increase of workers who would be covered in that particular industry code. So if the number of workers covered in a code would go up by 5%, what we would do is we would take that blended 5-10-year average and we would adjust our prediction of costs by the growth in the workforce. And when we map the change in the workforce with the change in costs, there's almost a perfect correlation between the two. They move lock and step. So workforce is a far better indicator than the time loss claim counts. And so what is going to change in the new model is that we will no longer look at time loss claims to forecast our future costs. We will rely on the blended averages adjusted for changes in the workforce moving forward. So in effect, you could think of it as we're adding an inflationary factor to what we're calculating in terms of future costs. Impact of this on the individual rate codes is as follows. There's one other element to the use of predictors for costs that I forgot to mention. So over time, we recognize kind of the weaknesses between the loss of correlation between claim costs and claim counts. And so in order to reduce the volatility of premium rates, what we did is we actually blended premium rates between this year and last year. So your 2017 premium rate is actually a blended rate, an average of the 2017 rate and the 2016 premium rate. Eckler said, you can no longer do that blending. There is no science or math behind it. It's worked well for you in terms of removing the volatility, but it's very weak on the accountability side. So strictly rely on the costs adjusted by the change in the workforce. So when we look at S32, this change would have brought an increase to the premium rate of 11 cents. The move to workforce from time loss injury rates had the effect of adding 15 cents to the premium rate. And that's because as time loss counts, time loss rates were dropping, as injury rates were dropping, and because we were using that injury rate to adjust the 5-year average, it was pushing our cost projection down lower. Because the workforce indicator is more stable and flat and it's higher than the lost time rate, that has the effect of adjusting the prediction of future costs upward. So that would have cost the S32 code 15 cents. However, the removal of the blending actually decreased the rate by 4 cents. So by no longer blending the rates, so what that means by us averaging the premium rates from 16 to 17, we actually held your rate 4 cents higher than it otherwise should have been. But now adjusting to workforce, the net effect of the 15 cents and the 4 cents is an 11 cent increase. When we look at S33, a similar outcome, a 7-cent increase, 11 cents of it the result of us moving to workforce and away from time loss counts, and a 4-cent reduction as a result of us removing the blending. The next recommendation had to do with something called claim cost pooling. Under the existing model, we cap the costs of pension claims at $90,000. So a pension claim is someone who's got long-term earnings loss and goes on a monthly pension or earnings replacement payment. When the cost of those claims hit $90,000, we capped that cost, and we took any costs in excess of that and we spread it out among the class members. So what a class is all of the S codes make up the S class. And it's more than S31, 32, because there's also S11 and 12 and 23, 24, 25. So all of the S codes would have borne some share of pension costs that any one of the rate codes in that class would have had that exceeded $90,000. That $90,000 was a fixed amount and has been there for at least 10 years. Eckler said two things. Why do you limit it just to pension costs? There should be a claims cost capping for all expensive claims. Because Eckler's notion of collective liability was, yes, employers should share in all of the liability, but employers should not be burdened by excessive claims costs. So he suggested that you apply a claims cap, not just to pension, but to all costs associated with a workplace injury. And secondly, that the cap should be somehow indexed so that it changes every year. And what he suggested is that the cap should be a multiple of the maximum insurable earnings. The recommendation and decision of the board is that we'll apply all costs up to a maximum of 3 times the maximum insurable wage for that particular industry in order to determine that particular industry's experience. 3 times the maximum is roughly $250,000. So if any claim, not just a pension claim, if any claims cumulative costs hit $250,000, we will cap that cost, and we will take the difference between the total cost of the claim at $250,000, and we'll spread it among all 50 rate codes based on their claims cost experience, not just the class. So if we have a fatality, and I'm going to talk about fatalities in a few minutes, if we have a fatality whose costs exceed $250,000, that one's going to be capped just like a short-term or a long-term injury claim. That doesn't result in a fatality. So what are the impacts of this? So for S32, it results in an impact of 4 cents. So had we implemented this, S32's premium rate would have gone up by 4 cents. And the reason for that is because this particular rate code benefited from that $90,000 cap on the pensions. And now that we remove that cap, if they have pensions in there that might be greater than $90,000 but less than $250,000, they're going to bear 100% of the cost of those claims. And so for that reason, this particular element would have caused the premium rate to increase. For S33, a similar story for exactly the same reason. However, this time the premium rate goes up by 3 cents. Speaking of fatalities, so under the current model, we calculate the 10-year average cost of all fatalities, and we charge every rate code with their share of that particular average. So in 2017, under the current model, every rate code is paying 4 cents in their premium rate to fund fatalities, regardless of whether they actually had a fatality or not. Eckler said we needed to increase the accountability of the rate codes where the fatalities are actually occurring. instead of spreading it all over the place and holding every industry, whether they had a fatality or not, accountable. The impact of this on the S32 code is actually a decrease. Now, this rate code actually had 2 fatalities in the last 5 years. So 2011 to 2015, there were 2 fatalities. But because the 5-year average, remember, we're not using a 10-year average for fatalities anymore, we're only using a 5-year average. Because the 5-year average is less than the 10-year average, it has a positive impact on the premium rate. In other words, the 4 cents that was being charged to all industry rate codes was a penny too high for this particular industry rate code. When we look at S32, a very similar story. This particular rate code also had, I believe, 2 fatalities. However, the cost of those fatalities, the 5-year average of those 2 fatalities, was less than the 10-year average cost, and therefore they realized a positive 2-cent impact on the premium rate. The last recommendation had to do with long-term claims. Excuse me. So I indicated to you that under the current model, we calculate a 5-year average, and we use that 5-year average adjusting for board-level experience, some other magic things that we did in order to deal with the volatility and stability of rates for all claims, regardless of the year that the injury actually occurred. We can pay a claim for up to 50 years if we have a really young injured worker. So you have an injured worker at 15 who's injured, and let's say it's a serious, there's permanent impairment. We're responsible for paying benefits till age 65. So for 2017 premium rates, we would be looking at the most recently 5 completed years to calculate the injury rate, or the injury costs. So we'd be starting in 2011 and going all the way up to 2015. That's the most recent 5 completed years. If in 2011, though, there's a claim that has costs associated with it, but the claim occurred 20 years ago, we use that cost in the 2011 costs. And similarly through 12 and 13 and 14 and 15. And the assumption there is, if you had a claim 50 years ago, there's a likelihood that 50 years from now you're going to have another claim. Eckler said, that's a really far-fetched assumption. And it doesn't create a very reactive model. What you need to do is you need to use more recent experience to predict future costs, not 50-year-old costs. You need to increase the reactivity and reliability of the model by shortening what actuaries call the tail of the claims costs that are in each of the respective years that go into your calculation. What the board has approved is that we will only look at claims up to 7 years old. By in so doing, we capture 75% of all costs for that particular rate code. So in 2011, when we bring the 2011 costs into the 5-year average, we'll only be going back 7 years to 2004. For 2012, we'll only be going back to all costs for injuries that are as old as 2005, and so on and so forth. So we're only bringing into the industry experience claims that are up to 7 years old in calculating that 5, or in the case of non-credible industries, the 10-year averages. The impact on S32 would have been an 8-cent increase in the premium rate. The reason this would happen is if my costs in the 5-year average cut off at 7 years old are greater than the costs in the remaining 43 years, then this is going to have the impact of increasing my premium rate because the average is going to go up. If the costs associated with cutting off the injury experience after 7 years, if the costs in that 7-year window are less than the remaining 43 years, this would have a positive impact and bring the premium rate down. Now, what happens to the remaining 43 years? Because we still have to pay those claims. What Eckler recommended and what the board has approved in terms of the new model is we would take the remaining costs, the remaining 43 years, and we would group those together and we would spread those across all industry codes at the board level. All 50 would pay a proportionate share based on their claims activity. So the impact on 32 would be an 8-cent increase because the 7-year experience is greater than the older experience. And on S33, a similar experience, but only 3 cents that way. The last recommendation had to do with the allocation of administration costs. So our administration costs fall into 2 buckets, just like all other businesses. And those relate to either fixed costs, so those are the costs required kind of regardless of the level of business that you might have. So it's all of your overhead costs, your lights and water and heat and administrative salaries. So for our organization, it would be salaries of the board and the executive. It would be our IT systems and all the other kind of you would consider to be standard overhead costs associated with running an organization like ours. The existing model assumes that the split between fixed and variable costs, so the variable costs are those costs for us that are associated directly with the management and adjudication of claims. The existing model assumed that 10% of our costs were fixed, and those costs were distributed among all employer rate codes based on their payroll. It assumed the other 90% was variable, and those costs were distributed to rate codes on the basis of claims costs. So the theory being the higher your claims cost, the more you're drawing on our variable services, and therefore you should pay a greater proportion of that. Eckler said, great strategy, great thing to be doing, but are you sure that the 90 and 10 are reflective of how you're actually spending your money? So we had a good idea. So we actually did some analysis and we determined that in fact it was not representative of how we spend our money. And in fact a 30-70 split was closer to how our administrative costs were actually being incurred than the 90-10 split. So the new model, instead of assuming a 10% fixed, now assumes a 30% fixed. And instead of assuming a 90% variable, assumes a 70% variable. Fixed costs are still allocated on the basis of payroll, variable costs on the basis of your claims costs. As a rule of thumb, if you have high payroll costs and relatively low claims costs, because the percentage of fixed costs is going up, you're going to pick up a greater proportion of the fixed costs, and so your premium rate's likely to go up. If your costs are high, then you're going to likely see, depending on the growth in the costs, you're likely going to see an increase in the variable component as well, and you're going to pick up a larger share of your variable component. So the idea is people who are using the system more ought to pay the system, but not just on the claim side, also on the non-claim side, which would include all our employer services as well. So what are the impacts on the S32 and 33 code? The S32 code would in fact see the administrative costs increase by 5 cents. So, and this is because the variable component actually falls. So your claims cost might be relatively stable, but because now you're only picking up your proportionate share of 70% of the costs, your share of the variable costs actually decreases. but your fixed costs actually increase. And the net effect is a 5-cent increase. So your variable costs are going down, variable costs are going down by roughly 1 cent, and your fixed costs are going up by 6 cents for a net effect of a 5-cent increase. Similar story at the S33 side. 2-cent increase, 6-cent increase on the fixed side, 4-cent decrease on the variable side, nets out to a 2-cent increase. So you might recognize that as we're going along, we just keep adding to this particular bar chart to show you that the various elements all work together within one model. So the net impact in terms of the overall premium rate is the sum of all of these parts. Some increases, some decreases, net out in order to calculate what the new rate would have been had we used this for 2017. So when we accumulate all of this by these two rate codes, see that the net effect on S32 would have been a 20-cent increase in the premium rate. Now, what does a 20-cent increase for S32 actually mean? It means that in total, the S32 rate code would have paid us an additional $643,300 in 2017. There are 1,719 employers in this rate code, so the average per employer would be $374. Now that's a one-time cost simply to transition from the old model to the new model. Does not take into account any changes in the experience that might also add or subtract to your premium rate code. For S33, the net effect is a 17-cent increase. What does this mean to S33? It means that in total, all employers within S33 together would have paid us an additional $273,300. There are 812 employers in this particular rate code, and so the average per employer would have been $337. So what's next? So today's full audio presentation is available on the website, so if you have colleagues at work, other members of your rate code that couldn't join us today either by webinar, it will be posted in the next few days, and they can go on and listen to this at any particular time that suits them. If you have any questions, of course, we would entertain receiving those either online right now or for those of you in the room at the microphone in the center of the room there. If you feel like you need to study this a little bit more, because this has been a fair bit of information that we've dumped on you, you can always post your questions at askwcb@wcbsas.com, and we will respond to you in a few days electronically with that. What the board is very interested in, as are we, is your feedback in terms of how we transition from old to new. So using S33 as an example, the total cost, did I do that sheet of paper? The total cost for S33 was $240-some thousand. Average cost to employer, I think, of $374. So how do we transition that? How do we mitigate the impact of that effect on the employers within the S33 code? Well, we might not at all. We just put all of the $374 into the system, and you're going to pay an additional $374 plus whatever change in your experience there is from 2017 to 18. We could look at phasing it in over a couple of years. So we would calculate your experience for 2018, and whatever your premium rate does, we would add an additional half, let's say, of the $374. So my math is terrible, but 150 plus bucks we would add to your total premium costs in order to fund the transition. We could do that over a couple of years. There are other options that you might have. If the increase is less than a certain amount, just put the whole thing in. If it's greater, phase it in or whatever the case may be. We'd be very, very interested in hearing your thoughts and ideas about how we might transition from old to new. And you can do that by going excuse me, to wcbsas.com/feedback and provide your feedback with respect to your thoughts on transitioning this. So there's no need to send in a bunch of faxes or a bunch of emails. You can just go post your thoughts and ideas right to our website. We will draw all that off. Feedback will be received up to the end of day April 7th, so 30 days from our last session, which is next week. After that period of time, we'll accumulate all of those responses and then take that back to the board with our recommendation of how we think we ought to proceed with implementing this. We have plenty of time left. If there are any questions, either online or those of you in the room, if you're courageous enough to step up to the microphone and ask, please do so. Anything online, Carolyn? Again, if you have nothing today and you need some time just to review and think about this, as I say, in a few days, this audio will be posted, as will the slide presentation. You can go through it again at your leisure and then fire any questions off to us through Ask WCB, and we will respond to you within a couple of days. We have a question. Excellent. Carolyn.
So when in the fall will the 2018 rate information be sent out to employers?
So we typically we have rate setting consultation in the fall, somewhere around mid-October. What we've been doing in the last couple of years is we've been doing just a general session where we talk about the average premium rate, and we make that available in Regina and Saskatoon through actual live video feed, I believe. We would do that again. And at the same time, what we offer is to any individual industry codes who would like a specific industry meeting, we're happy to actually come and meet with you, a group of you from your particular rate code, and share with you some information specifically about your industry code. At our general sessions, we do have available, and I do believe we post all of these online, we do have available information as it relates to each of the individual rate codes. So mid-September, we will announce what the preliminary rate is. Usually there's about a 30-day period to receive any feedback, and the board confirms final rates in early December. Another question? No other questions? Now, there's lots of time between now and October, so we're happy to provide you with information at any point between now and then that will just help you understand what might happen and better inform you, at least in the next month or so, in terms of what your thoughts are relative to transitioning. So given the impact on the S32, 33 codes, you can see why we didn't want to just send you out a bill with an additional 17-cent increase without you understanding exactly what was behind that particular increase. So this is just a proxy for what you might expect in terms of orders of magnitude for 2018, plus or minus any experience that you might have. So if there's nothing else, of course, it'd be remiss upon me not to remind everyone that the least expensive injury is the one that never ever happens. And while we've made tremendous progress with respect to reduction of injuries in this province, we're still a ways from achieving Mission Zero. In 2017, 88% of our workplaces went injury-free. We still have to work on those 13% in order to get us to that Mission Zero. And of course, what we were looking for is continued progression to the elimination of all injuries. One injury is just way too many. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for those who have joined us by webinar. And if there's no other questions, I bid you a good afternoon and a safe day. Thank you.